For 8 years, he had been the city's most mysterious radio repair technician. He never talked, never smiled, just fixed electronic devices. Customers called him Signal Man behind his back. But that day, when the customer who brought in the old military radio saw him, he froze. "Operator?" he whispered. And in that moment, everyone realized that this silent technician was anything but ordinary. Before we continue with this powerful story of hidden communication expertise and silent intelligence, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the quiet specialists walking among us. Chen's Electronics sat on the corner of Industrial Avenue and 5th Street, a narrow shop squeezed between a hardware store and a used bookstore. The modest storefront with its hand-painted sign and dusty windows gave no indication that inside worked one of the most skilled communications technicians in the city. For 8 years, the shop had been run by a man who fixed radios, televisions, and electronic equipment with an expertise that bordered on the supernatural. David Chen, though no one was certain that was his real name, was a figure who seemed to exist in the margins of normal commerce. He opened his shop at exactly 9 a.m., worked alone among towers of electronic components and testing equipment, and closed at 6 p.m. without ever varying his routine. Customers who brought their broken devices to Chen's Electronics found themselves dealing with a man who communicated primarily through nods, gestures, and the occasional technical diagnosis written on scraps of paper. The electronics repair community in the city had long since stopped trying to understand David's unusual business practices. He never advertised, never joined professional associations, and never seemed interested in expanding his small operation. Yet somehow, word of his exceptional skills had spread through informal networks of amateur radio operators, electronics hobbyists, and people who needed older equipment repaired by someone who understood obsolete technologies. Customers developed their own theories about David's background and his peculiar expertise. Most assumed he was simply introverted, perhaps someone who was more comfortable with machines than people. Others speculated that English might not be his first language, which would explain his reluctance to engage in casual conversation. But the nickname that stuck, Signal Man, reflected the unanimous opinion that David possessed an almost mystical understanding of electronic communications. But there were aspects of David's technical knowledge that suggested experience far beyond civilian electronics repair, if anyone had been paying close enough attention to notice them. His diagnostic methods followed patterns that seemed more systematic than typical repair shop procedures. When customers brought in radios with reception problems, David didn't just check the obvious components. He conducted what amounted to a complete signal analysis, testing frequency response, examining interference patterns, and evaluating the device's capability to receive and transmit across communication bands that most civilian radios never accessed. His workshop organization exceeded normal standards of precision. Every component, tool, and piece of testing equipment had its designated place, arranged with the kind of meticulous order that suggested training in environments where misplaced equipment could compromise critical operations. He maintained detailed logs of every repair, noting not just the technical problems but frequency ranges, signal characteristics, and performance specifications that seemed unnecessary for routine consumer electronics work. Most telling was his instinctive understanding of communication technologies that extended far beyond civilian radio systems. When a customer brought in a modified CB radio that had been configured for extended range operation, David immediately recognized the equipment as having been adapted for tactical communications, the kind of modifications that allowed civilian radios to interface with military communication networks in ways that weren't supposed to be possible. The customer, a former Army communications specialist, had asked David where he'd learned about tactical radio modifications. David's only response had been a written note, experience with similar systems. What none of them knew was that David Chen had spent 12 years as a signal intelligence specialist with the U.S. Army's 35th Signal Brigade. He had operated sophisticated communications interception equipment in locations where electronic warfare was conducted at levels of complexity that civilian electronics couldn't even approach. His understanding of radio frequencies, signal processing, and communication security had been developed not in repair shops, but in classified facilities where the ability to intercept, decode, and analyze enemy communications meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic intelligence failures. David's transition from military communications specialist to civilian electronics repair hadn't been planned. After his discharge, he had struggled to find work that utilized his specialized knowledge without requiring security clearances that connected him to classified projects he preferred to forget. Electronics repair had seemed like a logical application of his technical skills, allowing him to work with communication technologies without the life-and-death implications of military intelligence work. What he hadn't expected was how much the work would both satisfy and torment him. After years of intercepting enemy communications and processing intelligence that affected strategic military decisions, There was something therapeutic about fixing civilian radios where the most serious consequence of failure was someone missing their favorite talk show. But the constant exposure to communication equipment also triggered memories of operations that he had hoped civilian life would help him leave behind. On the morning everything changed. David was following his usual routine in what had started as a typically quiet day. He had repaired a vintage transistor radio for an elderly collector, diagnosed interference problems in a ham radio setup, and was working on a complex restoration of a 1960s shortwave receiver that required skills most modern electronics technicians no longer possessed. At 11:30 a.m., the shop's front door chimed with the arrival of a customer carrying what appeared to be an old military radio wrapped in a canvas bag. David looked up from his workbench to see a man in his 50s, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone with military experience. When the customer set the canvas bag on the counter and began unwrapping its contents, David felt his attention sharpen in ways that had nothing to do with routine electronics repair. The radio was a PRC-77, a Vietnam-era military field radio that had been the backbone of tactical communications for U.S. forces during that conflict. David recognized the device immediately, not just as a piece of historical electronics, but as equipment he had trained on during his own military service, when understanding legacy communication systems was essential for intelligence operations that required interoperability with older military units. "Found this in my father's garage," the customer said, his voice carrying the tone that suggested he wasn't entirely truthful about the radio's origin. "He served in Vietnam. Radio won't power up, and I'd like to get it working again for sentimental reasons." David nodded and began examining the PRC-77 with the systematic approach he applied to all electronic devices. But as his hands moved over the familiar controls, the frequency selector, the antenna connections, the battery compartment, muscle memory that had been dormant for years began to activate. He found himself automatically checking signal paths, frequency calibration, and encryption capabilities with the kind of thoroughness that went far beyond normal repair procedures. As David worked, he became aware that the customer was watching him with unusual intensity. The man's eyes followed David's diagnostic process with the kind of focused attention that suggested familiarity with military communications equipment. When David opened the radio's internal chassis and began testing components with specialized equipment that most civilian repair shops wouldn't possess, the customer's expression shifted from casual interest to something approaching recognition. "That's interesting test equipment," the customer said quietly. "Most radio shops wouldn't have signal analyzers capable of testing military frequency ranges." David continued working without responding, but he could feel the customer's scrutiny intensifying. The PRC-77's problems were complex: corroded battery connections, failed transistors, and calibration drift that required precision adjustments using techniques that weren't documented in civilian repair manuals. But David's hands moved with automatic expertise, making adjustments and repairs with the confidence of someone who had once depended on similar equipment for survival. After 45 minutes of methodical work, David had the PRC-77 operational. When he keyed the radio's transmit function for testing, the familiar sound of military communications protocols filled the small shop: frequency sweeps, signal tests, and the distinctive audio signatures that marked properly functioning tactical communications equipment. The customer listened to the radio's operational tests with growing certainty about what he was witnessing. When David handed back the fully functional PRC-77, their eyes met across the counter for the first time since the customer had entered the shop. "That's not civilian repair work," the customer said quietly. "The way you handled that equipment, the test procedures you used, the modifications you made to improve performance, that's military communications training." "Advanced military communications training." David remained silent, but something in his posture suggested readiness rather than relaxation. The customer leaned forward slightly, studying David's face with the kind of analytical intensity that suggested his own military background extended beyond routine service. "I was a communications officer for 22 years, he said. "Worked with signal intelligence units during my last deployment." "You're not just a radio repair technician." David met his gaze directly for the first time. "What makes you think that?" "Because I've seen exactly 3 people in my career who could repair a PRC-77 to better than original specifications using techniques that aren't in any manual. All 3 were signal intelligence specialists with clearances so high I wasn't supposed to know they existed." The customer reached into his jacket and pulled out a military ID card that identified him as Colonel James Mitchell, U.S. Army Signal Corps, retired. "The question is, which unit were you with, and why are you fixing civilian radios instead of working in communications security?" David studied the ID card for a long moment, then made a decision that would change the trajectory of his carefully constructed civilian life. 35th Signal Brigade, 12 years, and I'm fixing civilian radios because I wanted to use my skills for something other than intercepting enemy communications. Colonel Mitchell nodded slowly. "I thought so. The 35th had a reputation for producing the best sergeant specialists in the army. But that raises another question. Why would someone with your background be hiding in a repair shop? Because sometimes the skills that make you valuable in war make you dangerous to yourself in peace. Mitchell understood immediately. Signal intelligence specialists often struggled with civilian life because their training created permanent hypervigilance about electronic communications and information security. The constant awareness of how vulnerable civilian communications were, combined with knowledge of how easily personal information could be intercepted and analyzed, created a kind of technological paranoia that made normal life difficult. Have you considered that there might be ways to use your experience that don't require going back to classified work? Mitchell asked. The civilian sector desperately needs people who understand communications security, but most of the experts are still locked up in government agencies. David had considered it, but the prospect of returning to any form of intelligence-related work triggered memories he preferred to keep buried. I'm not interested in going back to that world. I'm not talking about intelligence work. I'm talking about teaching, training civilian communications professionals to understand security principles that could protect critical infrastructure from the kind of electronic warfare that's becoming routine in the civilian sector. Mitchell explained that he was now working as a consultant, helping civilian organizations understand vulnerabilities in their communications systems that could be exploited by hostile actors using techniques that signal intelligence specialists understood better than anyone. The work required people who could explain complex communications security concepts to civilian audiences without revealing classified methodologies. Think about it, Mitchell said as he prepared to leave. Your skills could help protect civilian communications infrastructure instead of attacking it, and you could do it without ever handling classified material again. After Mitchell left, David sat alone in his shop, surrounded by the familiar sounds of electronic testing equipment and radio frequencies. For 8 years, he had convinced himself that hiding his specialized knowledge was the best way to find peace after military service. But Mitchell's visit had forced him to confront the possibility that isolation might be preventing him from using his experience in ways that could make a meaningful difference. The PRC-77 sat on his workbench, fully functional and representing both his past as a signal intelligence specialist and his current identity as a civilian repair technician. Maybe there was a way to honor both identities without compromising either. That evening, David made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He called the number on Mitchell's business card. "I'd like to know more about the consulting work," he said when Mitchell answered. "Are you ready to stop hiding from who you are?" "I'm ready to find out if who I am can be useful without being destructive." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours and ended with David agreeing to meet with Mitchell's team to discuss how signal intelligence expertise could be adapted for civilian communications security consulting. For the first time in 8 years, he would be working with people who understood exactly what his specialized knowledge represented. As David closed his shop that night, he realized that his identity as Signal Man, the mysterious technician who fixed radios without explanation, was about to evolve into something more complex but potentially more meaningful. Maybe Mitchell was right. Maybe the skills that had once been used to intercept enemy communications could be repurposed to protect civilian infrastructure from similar threats. But that would mean acknowledging parts of his military experience that he had spent 8 years trying to forget, and accepting that his signal intelligence background was something to be utilized rather than hidden. So I ask you, have you ever encountered someone whose technical expertise seems to extend far beyond their apparent job requirements? Someone whose knowledge of specialized systems suggested training and experience that they couldn't discuss? Share their story in the comments, because sometimes the most valuable technical skills belong to people whose real qualifications were earned in circumstances that must remain classified. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor the quiet specialists who carry technical expertise from military service into civilian professions. Because sometimes the most important knowledge belongs to people whose real training happened in facilities that don't officially exist. And next time you encounter exceptional technical competence in an ordinary setting, remember that excellence often comes from experience that can't be explained, but never stops serving.